She never thought that falling asleep on a velvet sofa would be the moment her entire life would change forever. Emma Rodriguez, 23 years old, with tired brown eyes and callous hands from years of hard work, was just another invisible face in a luxurious Grandview hotel. Every morning at 5, she'd tie her dark hair into a tight bun, put on her uniform, and disappear into the world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers that would never belong to her. Alexander Sterling was everything Emma wasn't. At 32, he owned half a Manhattan skyline, including the very hotel where she worked. With piercing blue eyes that could close million-dollar deals with a single glance, he moved through life like a king in his kingdom. His tailored suits cost more than Emma made in 6 months, but beneath that polished exterior was a man who hadn't felt genuinely alive in years. The Grandview Hotel stood like a golden fortress on Fifth Avenue, where the wealthy came to forget their troubles in $1,000-a-night suites. The penthouse suite, Alexander's personal retreat, was a sanctuary of Italian marble, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, and furniture that belonged in museums. It was a world where people like Emma existed only to clean up after the dreams of others. That fateful Tuesday started like any other. Emma had been assigned to clean the penthouse, while Alexander was supposed to be in Tokyo closing a deal. She'd already worked a shift at the diner downtown, starting at 4 in the morning, before rushing to the hotel. Her feet ached in the practical black shoes, and her back protested every movement. But Mrs. Chen's chemotherapy wasn't going to pay for itself, and Emma would work until she dropped before letting her adoptive mother suffer. The penthouse was a universe unto itself. 20-foot ceilings made her feel like an ant in a palace. The living room alone was bigger than the entire apartment she shared with Mrs. Chen in Queens. As she polished the already spotless surfaces, Emma allowed herself a moment to imagine what it would be like to belong here, to wake up to that view, to never worry about tomorrow's rent or yesterday's medical bills. Exhaustion has a way of catching up with you when you're running on 3 hours of sleep and countless cups of cheap coffee. As she sat down for just a moment on the impossibly soft sofa, her body betrayed her. The cushion seemed to embrace her tired form, and the afternoon sun streaming through the windows felt like a warm blanket. Her eyes grew heavy. Just 5 minutes, she told herself. Just 5 minutes to rest. Alexander's meeting had been canceled at the last minute. The Japanese investors had gotten cold feet, wasting his entire flight. Frustrated and jet-lagged, he decided to return to his suite early. He needed silence, solitude, and probably a very expensive whiskey. What he didn't expect was to find his sanctuary occupied. His hand was already reaching for his phone to call security when he stopped. There, curled up on his sofa like a cat in the sun, was the most beautiful sight he'd seen in years. Not because of designer clothes or perfect makeup, but because of the pure, unguarded peace on her face. Her uniform was wrinkled. A strand of dark hair had escaped her bun to fall across her cheek, and her hand was tucked under her face like a child's. For the first time in his life, Alexander Sterling stood frozen, afraid to disturb something so perfect. He found himself studying her, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many long nights, the way her fingers were reddened from cleaning chemicals. A book of poetry had fallen from her bag onto his Persian rug, its pages worn from reading. Alexander picked it up carefully, surprised to find margins filled with handwritten notes in Spanish and English. Original verses about finding beauty in broken things, about dreams that survived despite concrete and steel. When Emma's eyes fluttered open 20 minutes later, she found herself staring into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. Terror flooded through her as she recognized the hotel's owner. She scrambled to her feet, apologies tumbling from her lips in a mix of English and Spanish. This was it. She was fired. No reference. No way to pay for next week's medications. But Alexander didn't look angry. He looked curious. "Please sit," he said, his voice gentler than the tabloids would have anyone believe. "Tell me about this poem, the one about windows and souls. If you believe that love can bloom where no one expects, maybe it's time to join us on this journey." What followed was the most surreal hour of Emma's life. The billionaire CEO everyone feared was sitting on his own floor, discussing Pablo Neruda and Emily Dickinson with a maid who shouldn't even exist in his world. He told her about the poetry classes he'd taken in college before his father's death had forced him into boardrooms. She shared how she wrote verses on napkins during her breaks at the diner, finding metaphors in coffee stains and broken dishes. "You're not firing me?" Emma finally asked, still convinced this was some elaborate dream. "Fire you? You're the first person to make this place feel like a home instead of a museum. But perhaps we could arrange for you to sleep in an actual bed." His smile was crooked, almost boyish, completely at odds with the stone-faced businessman in the financial magazines. Emma found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. That should have been the end of it. A strange, sweet moment that both will remember but never mention again. But the next day, Emma found a first edition of Neruda's 20 love poems and a song of despair hidden beneath the sofa cushions, exactly where she'd fallen asleep. Inside was a note, for someone who finds poetry in unexpected places. She responded by leaving a poem of her own, written on hotel stationery, tucked between the pages of his Wall Street Journal. It was about a castle in the clouds and the boy who'd forgotten how to dream. When Alexander found it, he stood by his window for a full hour, reading and rereading her words. Their secret correspondence became the highlight of both their days. Alexander would leave notes hidden in places only Emma would clean, behind picture frames, inside decorative vases, beneath the phone in his private study. Emma would respond with poems, observations, sometimes just drawings of the city as seen from his windows. Neither acknowledged it directly when they passed in the halls, but their eyes would meet for just a moment, sharing a secret that belonged only to them. We have more stories like this coming, so don't forget to hit the like button and turn on notifications. 3 weeks into their correspondence, Alexander broke protocol. His note that day wasn't poetry but an invitation. "There's a reading at the Strand bookstore tonight. Adrian Rich. Would you perhaps want to discuss metaphors in person? I'll be in the poetry section at 7. Emma stared at the note for so long that Maria, her co-worker, asked if she was feeling ill. How could she explain that the most powerful man in New York had just asked her to a poetry reading? That for weeks now, she'd been falling for someone through hidden notes and borrowed verses? She almost didn't go. 3 times she walked past the bookstore before finally entering. Alexander was there, dressed down in jeans and a sweater she never imagined he owned, looking almost nervous. When he saw her, his face lit up in a way that made her forget he could buy the entire bookstore if he wanted. "You came," he said simply. "You invited me," she replied. They spent the evening lost in words, both the poet's and their own. Alexander bought her dinner at a tiny Thai place where no one recognized him, and they talked until the owner gently informed him he needed to close. About poetry, yes, but also about dreams deferred and paths not taken. Emma learned that Alexander had wanted to be a teacher before his father's empire had claimed him. Alexander discovered that Emma had been accepted to Columbia on a full scholarship, but had given it up when Mrs. Chan had gotten sick. "Why didn't you tell me you were a student?" he asked. "I'm not. I'm a maid who used to be a student." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "You're still the smartest person I've talked to all week. And that includes 3 Nobel laureates and the Federal Reserve Chairman." Emma laughed, but there was sadness in it. "In your world, maybe that matters. In mine, I'm just a girl who cleans up after the smart people." Alexander reached across the table, his fingers barely brushing hers. "Then maybe it's time we stop living in separate worlds. Would you have done the same?" I'd love to know what you think, but fairy tales don't exist in Manhattan, and soon reality began to intrude on their bubble. The first sign of trouble came when Victoria Sterling decided to make a surprise inspection of her son's hotel properties. Alexander's mother was 70 years old, but moved like a woman half her age, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her Chanel suit impeccable, her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She found her son having coffee with a maid in his office. The conversation appeared innocent enough. They were discussing staffing schedules. But Victoria Sterling hadn't built an empire by missing subtle cues. The way her son's eyes softened when he looked at the girl. The careful distance they maintained. Too careful, like people working hard not to touch. "Alexander, darling," she said after Emma had been dismissed. "Please tell me you're not being foolish." "I don't know what you mean, Mother." "The maid. Pretty little thing, I'll grant you, but really, darling, we're announcing your engagement to Cassandra next month. The merger papers are already drawn up." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I never agreed to marry Cassandra." "No, but you agreed to protect your father's legacy. The Whitmore shipping fortune, combined with our properties, will create the largest real estate empire in the country. Don't throw that away for some cleaning girl with pretty eyes." Emma, meanwhile, was facing her own battles. Rosa and Maria, her co-workers, had noticed the special attention she'd been receiving, the way Mr. Sterling's eyes followed her, the mysterious books that appeared in her locker, the fact that she'd been assigned exclusively to the penthouse, a job usually rotated to prevent exactly this kind of situation. "Just be careful, Mija," Rosa warned. "I've seen this before. Rich men get bored. They play with girls like us. Then they go back to their own kind. Don't let him break your heart." But it was already too late for warnings. Emma's heart had been lost somewhere between a hidden note about the way morning light looked like hope and an evening discussing whether love was a choice or a destiny. She tried to build walls, to remind herself of all the reasons this was impossible, but Alexander had a way of dismantling her defenses with a single smile. Things escalated the night of Alexander's birthday. He'd told his mother he was spending it at a business dinner, but instead, he'd asked Emma to meet him on the hotel's roof. She'd never been there before. It was off limits to staff, but Alexander had cleared it for the evening. He'd set up a small table with champagne and takeout from the Thai restaurant, surrounded by potted plants he'd bought because she'd mentioned missing her grandmother's garden in Puerto Rico. "This is too much," Emma whispered, taking in the fairy lights he'd strung between plants. "Nothing is too much for you," he replied, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe it. They danced to music from his phone. The city lights spread below them like a carpet of stars. For a moment, Emma allowed herself to forget that she was a maid and he was a billionaire. They were just two people finding each other against all odds. "I'm falling in love with you," Alexander whispered against her hair. Emma pulled back to look at him, tears in her eyes. "You can't. Your world, my world, they don't mix, Alexander." "Then let's create our own world." He kissed her then, soft and sweet under the New York sky, and Emma felt her last defenses crumble. She kissed him back, pouring all her fears and hopes into that moment, knowing it might be all they ever had. But someone had seen them. Cassandra Whitmore, Alexander's supposed fiancée, had grown suspicious of his excuses. She'd hired a private investigator to follow him, and the photos of him kissing a maid on the rooftop were exactly the ammunition she needed. The confrontation came at the worst possible moment. The Sterling Foundation was hosting its annual gala, a $1,000 plate dinner that raised money for various charities. Alexander had done something unprecedented. He'd invited Emma as his guest, not as staff. He'd even sent her a gown, a flowing midnight blue creation that made her feel like she stepped out of a dream. "You look beautiful," he whispered when he saw her, and the pride in his eyes made her stand taller. For 2 hours, Emma experienced what it was like to be on Alexander's arm officially. The stairs were there, of course. Whispers followed them like shadows. Who was she? Where did she come from? Wasn't that the girl who cleaned the rooms? But Alexander kept her close, introducing her simply as Emma Rodriguez, a poet and the most interesting person you'll meet tonight. Then Cassandra struck. She waited until the middle of Alexander's speech about the importance of breaking down social barriers, then stood up, her voice carrying across the ballroom. Speaking of social barriers, Alexander, why don't you tell everyone about your interesting choice of date? Everyone meet Emma Rodriguez. She's not a poet. She's a maid at the Grandview. Oh, but that's not the most interesting part. She pulled out her phone, projecting images onto the large screen behind Alexander. Photos of Emma from 3 years ago, dressed in designer clothes. On the arm of Marcus Fitzgerald, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune. Articles about their engagement, their sudden breakup. His claims that she'd only been after his money. It seems Miss Rodriguez is a type, Cassandra continued, her smile sharp as a blade. Rich men who confuse lust with love. Tell me, Emma, is Alexander just your latest target? Or are you actually planning to stick around after you've gotten what you want? The ballroom erupted in whispers. Emma stood frozen, feeling 1,000 eyes dissecting her. But it was Alexander's face that broke her heart. For just a second, just one horrible second, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. That moment of hesitation was all it took. Emma turned and ran, her beautiful gown catching on chairs as she fled, tears blinding her vision. Alexander called after her, but his mother's hand on his arm stopped him. Let her go, darling. It's better this way. Now you know what she really is. But Alexander didn't know anything anymore. The woman he'd fallen in love with, the poet who saw beauty in broken things, who worked 3 jobs to save her mother, who laughed at his terrible jokes and challenged him to be better. Was she real? Or had he been just another mark in a long con? Emma didn't show up for work the next day. Or the next. Or the next. Her supervisor reported that she'd called in sick, then simply stopped calling at all. Alexander found himself haunted by her absence. The penthouse felt cold again, a museum instead of a home. He looked for her poems, her notes, any trace of the woman who'd made him feel alive, but found only silence. It was Mrs. Chun who finally told him the truth. Alexander had tracked down Emma's address, needing answers, needing closure, needing her. The elderly woman who answered the door was thin, clearly ill, but her eyes were fierce with protective love. You're him, she said simply, the one who broke my Emma's heart. She broke mine first, Alexander replied, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Come in. You need to know the truth about Marcus Fitzgerald. The story she told over tea in the tiny Queen's apartment shattered everything Alexander thought he knew. Emma had met Marcus at Columbia, where she'd been studying on a full scholarship. He pursued her relentlessly, charming and persistent. Young and naive, she believed his promises of love. The engagement had been his idea, pushed through despite her protest that was too fast. The abuse started small, Mrs. Chen explained, her voice heavy with remembered pain, controlling what she wore, who she talked to. Then it got worse. When she tried to leave, he threatened to destroy her reputation, to make sure she never got her degree. He said no one would believe a Puerto Rican girl from Queens over Fitzgerald. But she left anyway. She ran, gave up her scholarship, her dreams, everything. Came home to me and started over. When I got sick, she took any job she could find. The hotel paid well, had good insurance. She was rebuilding her life piece by piece until I came along and destroyed it again, Alexander finished. Mrs. Chen's eyes softened slightly. She loves you, you know, really loves you. I haven't seen her write poetry since Columbia, but these past weeks, she filled notebook after notebook, all about a man who made her believe in fairy tales again. Alexander left the apartment with a weight in his chest and fire in his veins. He had work to do. The truth about Marcus Fitzgerald wasn't hard to uncover once Alexander started looking. Sealed court records that money could unseal. Other women who'd been too afraid to speak up before. A pattern of abuse hidden behind wealth and privilege. Within a week, Alexander had enough evidence to destroy Marcus 10 times over. But destroying Marcus wasn't enough. Alexander needed to prove to Emma that he was different, that their love was different. He started by stepping down as CEO of Sterling Industries, shocking the business world. He liquidated his personal fortune, keeping only enough to live modestly, and created the Phoenix Foundation, a massive fund dedicated to helping women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives. He moved out of the penthouse into a simple apartment in Brooklyn. He took a job teaching business at a community college, remembering his old dream of being an educator. He learned to cook, to do laundry, to live like the rest of the world. Not for show, not to prove a point, but because he finally understood that his wealth had been a wall between him and real life. The poetry readings at the Strand became his sanctuary. Every Tuesday, he'd sit in the back row, hoping to see her. She never came, but he kept going, kept listening to words about love and loss and hope, kept believing that poetry had brought them together once and might do so again. Emma, meanwhile, was building her own new life. The notoriety from the gala had actually helped in an unexpected way. Other women who'd worked in service, who'd been made to feel invisible, reached out to her. Together, they formed a cleaning cooperative, where the workers owned the business and shared the profits. Dignity Cleaning Services started small but grew quickly, their story resonating in a city tired of inequality. She heard about Alexander's transformation. Of course, it was all over the news. Billionaire gives away fortune. Sterling heir chooses love over money. The tabloids had a field day, but Emma refused to reach out. If he'd truly changed, it couldn't be for her. It had to be for himself. 6 months after the gala, fate intervened again. Emma was giving a talk at a women's shelter about starting over, about finding strength in sisterhood, when she noticed a familiar figure in the back row. Alexander looked different. His hair was longer, his clothes simple, but his eyes, those blue eyes that had seen through her defenses, were the same. He waited until everyone else had left before approaching. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," she replied, her heart hammering. "I loved your speech. The part about windows and souls. I remember that poem." Emma smiled despite herself. You always did have a good memory for poetry. They talked for hours in that empty room about everything that had happened, everything that had changed. Alexander showed her photos of his students, talked about the joy of teaching. Emma shared her plans for expanding cooperative, maybe even starting a scholarship fund. Neither mentioned their relationship, the elephant in the room, growing larger with each passing minute. Finally, as the shelter staff began turning off lights, Alexander stood to leave. "I should go, but Emma, I want you to know something. I didn't change for you. I changed because you showed me who I could be, who I wanted to be. Whether or not you ever speak to me again, I'll always be grateful for that." He was at the door when Emma called out, "Alexander?" He turned, hope flickering in his eyes. "There's a reading next Tuesday. Adrian Rich again. Maybe we could discuss metaphors." His smile was answer enough. "Would you like to believe that sometimes love stories need intermissions? That sometimes we need to become whole people on our own before we can truly be together?" The next Tuesday, they met at the Strand, and the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt what had been shattered. But this time it was different. They weren't a billionaire and a maid finding each other across an impossible divide. They were Alexander and Emma, two people who'd learned that love wasn't about saving each other, but about choosing each other again and again. The proposal came a year later, not in a fancy restaurant or a rooftop under stars, but in the community center Emma had helped establish. Alexander was teaching a free business class to aspiring entrepreneurs. Emma was running a poetry workshop in the next room. During the break, he knocked on her door. "Sorry to interrupt," he said to her students, "but I have a question for Ms. Rodriguez." He got down on one knee right there, in front of 15 teenage poets, who immediately started recording on their phones. "Emma Rodriguez, you taught me that love is finding poetry in unexpected places. You are my unexpected place, my favorite poem, my home. Will you marry me?" The ring was simple, a thin gold band with a single pearl. "Because you taught me that the most beautiful things come from surviving difficulty," he explained later. Emma said yes through tears, and her students erupted in cheers that brought Alexander's class running to see what was happening. Their wedding was a reflection of the life they'd built together, not in a grand ballroom, but in the community center, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd touched. Former student of Alexander's, women from Emma's cooperative, poets from the Strand, and yes, even Victoria Sterling, who'd finally understood that her son had found something worth more than any merger. Emma wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit. Alexander's groomsmen were the janitors from the Grandview, who become his friends during his evening visits to see Emma. Mrs. Chun, healthy now thanks to experimental treatment the Phoenix Foundation had helped fund, walked Emma down the aisle. The vows were, naturally, poems they'd written for each other. Alexander's was about finding light in unexpected places, about how a man living in the clouds had needed to fall to earth to learn to fly. Emma's was about second chances and strong foundations, about love that grows not in spite of struggle, but because of it. "I love you without knowing how, or when, or from where," Alexander whispered as he lifted her veil, quoting Neruda one more time. "I love you straightforwardly, without complexities or pride," Emma responded, completing the verse. As they kissed, the community center erupted in joy. Outside it had started to rain, but inside there was nothing but warmth and light and the promise of tomorrow. 5 years later, Alexander and Emma Sterling Rodriguez run the Phoenix Foundation together, having helped thousands of women escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. Alexander still teaches at the community college, now as a full professor. Emma's cooperative has expanded to 5 cities, and she published her first poetry collection, Love Poems from Unexpected Places, which became a surprise bestseller. They live in a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, filled with books and plants and the laughter of their 2 children, Sophia and Gabriel, who are being raised to understand that true wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with love, integrity, and the courage to see people for who they really are. Every Tuesday, they still go to poetry readings at the Strand. Sometimes they're recognized. The billionaire who gave it all up for love, and the maid who became a CEO. But mostly, they're just Alexander and Emma, 2 people who found each other in the most unlikely way and proved that love doesn't care about bank accounts or social status. On quiet nights, when the children are asleep and the city hums outside their window, Emma sometimes thinks about that Tuesday afternoon when she fell asleep on a velvet sofa. How exhaustion had led to conversation, conversation to connection, connection to love. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was better. It was real, complicated, difficult, and absolutely worth it. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Alexander one evening as they sat on a fire escape, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset over Brooklyn. "Giving up everything?" He pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "I didn't give up anything. I traded an empty castle for a full life. I traded board meetings for faculty meetings, mergers for poetry, and loneliness for love. Best deal I ever made." Emma smiled, thinking of the young woman who'd been so tired, so afraid, so certain that people like her didn't get happy endings. That woman had been wrong. Happy endings weren't about being rescued by a prince or transforming into a princess. They were about two people brave enough to see each other clearly, to choose each other daily, and to build something beautiful from the ground up. In the distance, Manhattan glittered like a jewel, the Grand View Hotel standing tall among the skyscrapers. Sometimes Emma wondered if another tired girl was up there, cleaning rooms and dreaming of more. If so, she hoped that girl knew that dreams didn't have to stay dreams. Sometimes they just needed a little poetry, a lot of courage, and the willingness to fall asleep exactly where you're meant to wake up. Love finds us in the most unexpected moments, in the most unlikely places. It doesn't ask for our resumes or check our bank statements. It simply asks us to be brave enough to let ourselves be seen, flaws and all. Emma and Alexander's story reminds us that the greatest risk we can take is opening our hearts, and the greatest reward is finding someone who sees us not for what we have, but for who we are. And sometimes, just sometimes, falling asleep on a job can lead to the awakening of a lifetime. Because love, real love, is the greatest poetry of all, unpredictable, transformative, and absolutely worth believing in. If you're still watching, maybe you're searching for your own unexpected love story. Remember, it might not come the way you expect. It might require you to let go of who you think you should be to become who you really are. But one thing is certain. Somewhere out there, someone is waiting to see you, really see you, and find poetry in the beautiful complexity of your soul. After all, we all deserve a love story that begins with falling asleep and ends with being fully, brilliantly, courageously awake.